If you've never read the Bible before, don't start with Genesis. Start with Mark. Why not start with the book of Genesis? Isn't that the beginning? That does make a lot of sense. Genesis gives you the beginning of the story, but it doesn't give you the beginning of understanding. And you should start with Mark because it gives you the earliest, the rawest, and the most foundational account that you have of the life of Jesus. And once you read and discover the book of Mark, you are going to better understand the beginning of the Bible, starting with Genesis, because we have to read it from the perspective and in light of the work, the mission, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Here are 3 reasons for why you should start reading the Bible with the book of Mark. First, you are forced into discovery, especially with the messianic secret. Second, Mark is the foundation. It's inside the other gospels. Third, it's very structural and its approach is gradual. There's a beginning, a middle, and a climax. Let's talk about the first reason. If you start with the book of Mark, you are going to find out very quickly that there is a mystery about the identity of Jesus. This is sometimes referred to in the literature as the messianic secret. So in Mark, Jesus does something very strange. For example, in Mark chapter 1, verse 44, Jesus heals people but tells them not to tell anybody. In Mark chapter 1 verse 34, it talks about the demons that recognize Jesus and Jesus quickly silences them. You also see this in Mark chapter 3, Mark chapter 5, and Mark chapter 8. This is something that has confused scholars for a long time. Because why would Jesus try to conceal his identity? What seems to be happening here is that Mark is not trying to tell you who Jesus is up front. He's trying to force you to find out. And he's doing that because he wants to place you not so much outside of the text, but he wants you to participate in the process. In other words, he's trying to put you in the shoes of the disciple. And so you're not just reading about the disciples, you are being positioned in their place. And that does a number of things. It activates your curiosity, it creates tension, and whenever the answer is not given directly or handed over to you, and you have to discover it slowly and over time as you read the text, that's very powerful. And it's powerful because people generally don't remember information they're handed, but they do remember discoveries. Today we have the benefit of hindsight because we know what happened in the story, but the disciples back then were going with Jesus and moving around with him and seeing things as they happen in real time. And so Jesus didn't want them to reach any premature conclusions about who he is. So that's what you get with the book of Mark that you don't get so much, for example, with the book of John. Let me say the book of John is very powerful theologically, but it informs you right off the bat who Jesus is. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. He points to all of these things for you. So John gives you the answer, but Mark gives you the process of discovery. Second reason, Mark is inside the other Gospels. In fact, about 90% of the Gospel of Mark is found in the Gospel of Matthew. About 65% of the Gospel of Mark is found in the book of Luke. That's what scholars actually refer to as the synoptic hypothesis, meaning Mark is likely the earliest written account, and then his account pretty much formed the backbone for the other 2 Gospels. So when you're reading Mark in this case, you're not just reading one Gospel, you're actually reading the foundation. That's not to say that the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of Matthew are any less informative. In fact, they are equally important. For example, in the book of Matthew, you get more detailed teaching, and in the book of Luke, you get more narrative, more flow to what Jesus does and why he does certain things. And so Mark gives you this initial framework, and the other Gospels illuminate that same reality, but in different ways. The third reason is the structure. Mark builds slowly, and he uses various techniques in his writing. The most interesting of which is called intercalation, or we could say sandwiching. And what that means is that he would start the story, interrupt that story with another one, and then he comes back to the first one. And the idea here is that Mark is not trying to give you the information. He's trying to create this tension where you read one story and use that to help you illuminate and understand the other. And that's what makes Mark's approach so interesting. It's not linear, it is layered structurally. A famous example of that is when you have the woman that had been bleeding for 12 years. Mark interrupts that story and talks about Jairus' daughter, who was 12 years old. You're seeing the number 12 in the first story, the number 12 in the second story. There's a woman who's taking initiative on trying to get her healing. And then you have another story where you have this little girl who is not able to take initiative, is not able to speak on her own behalf, and you have somebody else doing the talking for her, and that's her father. If you put the two stories together, you get women on both ends of the spectrum, the old and the young, the able and the incapable, and so on and so forth. The message seems to be that Jesus is coming to help, assist, heal everybody that is along that very spectrum. So that's what Mark is trying to do. He's trying to get you to interpret things. By sandwiching two stories together, you pull them apart, and then you start finding out how everything is building up. So now that we have everything together, if somebody with absolutely no background and knew nothing about Christianity happened to discover the Gospel of Mark and started reading it, what would they experience? I'm gonna tell you this, it's not going to be clarity, but it's going to be progression. First, you get the mystery of it. Who is this man? And Jesus is telling everybody, do not reveal who I am. The second part of it is going to be the shock of what happens to Jesus when he's tortured, he's crucified, and he dies on the cross. And then the last part, the climax, is going to be the expectation, because the earliest manuscripts of Mark actually ended with Mark chapter 16, verse 8, and that's only with the empty tomb. We don't have a discussion of the apparition after the resurrection. And so what happens here is that Mark, instead of resolving the tension at the end, he actually hands it over to the reader, and the reader has to figure out what that ending could be like. For more biblical tips, insights, and mysteries of the Bible that I try to uncover, given my background, given my perspective, I want you to subscribe so you can get more and more information from me.